If her parents had looked her in the eye and told her she did not matter, Helen might have accepted it, but what they did hurt even more. They spoke softly, almost gently, and said, "We need to use your school money for your brother. Just for now." Helen stood still, her heart tightening as the words settled in. She asked quietly, "For how long?" Her father avoided her gaze and replied, "We will sort it out soon." In that moment something inside Helen changed, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. She nodded slowly and said, "All right," even though she already knew nothing about it was all right. Helen had always been the one holding everything together while her older brother Logan was treated like he could never fail. "Logan just needs more support," their mother would say every single time. "You are strong, Helen, you will be fine." While Logan received money, attention, and endless second chances, Helen worked quietly and carried responsibilities no one ever noticed. She handled errands, helped around the house, and stepped in whenever things began to fall apart. One afternoon, her friend Miriam asked her, "Don't you ever get tired of being the strong one?" Helen gave a small smile and replied, "I don't have a choice." The promise of trade school was the one thing Helen held onto through years of silence and sacrifice. "We will pay for your program after graduation," her father had told her confidently. Helen believed him completely and built her entire future around that promise. She once told Miriam with excitement, "This is my chance to finally stand on my own." But now, standing in that same kitchen hearing that the money was gone, she felt everything inside her collapse. Her mother stepped closer and said gently, "Your brother is in serious trouble, we have to help him." Helen looked at her and replied calmly, "You always do." That night, Helen did not argue or raise her voice about what had just happened. Instead, she went to her room, closed the door, and sat quietly for a long time. "If I stay here, I will keep disappearing," she whispered to herself. The next day, she called Miriam and asked, "Is your aunt still renting that small apartment?" Miriam paused, surprised, then asked, "Wait, are you leaving?" Helen took a deep breath and answered, "I have to." Over the next few days, she moved carefully, packing little by little so no one would notice. At home, she still smiled, still answered questions, still played her role perfectly. Early one morning, before anyone else woke up, Helen stood in her room and looked around one last time. "All these years, and this is everything," she said softly. She picked up her bag, walked into the kitchen, and placed a note on the table. It read, "I waited to matter, but I cannot wait anymore." As she stepped outside, the cool morning air touched her face, and for the first time she felt free. She got into her car, started the engine, and looked at the house through the mirror. Then she whispered, "I choose myself now," and drove away without looking back. The first few days on her own were not easy, but they were peaceful in a way Helen had never experienced before. She stood in the small apartment, looking around at the bare walls and worn furniture, and whispered, "At least this is mine." Everything she had now depended on her, and for the first time that felt right. She called her boss and said, "I need more hours, I am ready to work full-time." He paused for a second, then replied, "I have been waiting for you to say that." Helen smiled faintly and said, "I am not waiting for anything anymore." That single decision marked the beginning of a life no one could control but her. Helen quickly learned that independence came with its own kind of pressure, but it was a pressure she welcomed. She stood in a grocery store one evening, holding 2 different brands of food, quietly calculating which one she could afford. "This is what real life feels like," she muttered to herself. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt focused, like every small decision mattered now. When Miriam visited her a few days later, she looked around and said, "It's small, but it feels peaceful." Helen nodded and replied, "Because no one is taking anything from me here." For the first time, her hard work was building her own future, not fixing someone else's mistakes. Determined not to lose her dream, Helen went to the technical college to explore other options. She sat across from an advisor and said, "I was supposed to start this program, but I lost my funding." The advisor leaned forward and replied, "Then let's find another way." Together, they mapped out payment plans, grants, and part-time options that Helen had never considered before. "It will take longer," the advisor explained, "but it is completely possible." Helen nodded with quiet determination and said, "I don't mind taking longer, I just need to move forward." That day she walked out of the office with something more powerful than money. She walked out with control. Back at home, things began to slowly fall apart without Helen there to hold everything together. Her father struggled to manage his work properly and started missing important details he once relied on her to handle. "Why is everything suddenly so disorganized?" he complained one evening. Her mother, overwhelmed with her own responsibilities, snapped back, "Because she is not here anymore." Logan, meanwhile, continued living carelessly, unaware of how much pressure he was placing on everyone else. One night, her mother sighed and said, "We didn't realize how much she was doing." Her father went quiet, but deep down he knew that realization had come too late. Weeks passed and Helen began to settle into a rhythm that slowly rebuilt her confidence. She worked long hours, saved carefully, and stayed focused on her goal without distractions. One evening, sitting alone in her apartment, she looked at her notebook and said, "I am still going to make this happen." Miriam called her and asked, "Do you ever regret leaving?" Helen thought for a moment, then replied, "No, I regret staying as long as I did." That answer surprised even her, because it carried no anger, only clarity. In that moment, Helen understood something powerful. She was no longer the girl waiting to be chosen, she had chosen herself. As weeks turned into months, the absence of Helen began to create cracks that could no longer be ignored. Her father started missing deadlines and losing small jobs that once came easily to him. One afternoon he muttered in frustration, "This never used to happen." Her mother looked at him and replied quietly, "Because she used to handle it." The house no longer ran smoothly and simple things began to feel overwhelming. Bills were misplaced, schedules were forgotten, and tension slowly filled the space Helen once kept stable. Even Logan began to notice the difference, though he refused to admit it out loud. Logan's situation only grew worse as time passed, bringing more pressure into the already strained household. He lost the little work he had and spent most of his days doing nothing useful. One evening, their father raised his voice and said, "You need to start taking responsibility for your life." Logan shrugged and replied, "I'll figure it out, just relax." Their mother sat quietly, watching the conversation unfold, clearly exhausted. "We cannot keep doing this," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. For the first time, the same excuses that once protected Logan began to sound empty. Meanwhile, Helen continued building her life step by step with quiet determination. She worked longer hours, saved more money, and stayed focused on her goal without looking back. One evening, Miriam visited again and said, "You are different now, stronger." Helen smiled and replied, "No, I am just finally living for myself." They sat together, talking about the future, making plans that felt real and achievable. Unlike before, Helen no longer needed anyone's approval to move forward. She had created a life where every step she took belonged entirely to her. Back at the house, the pressure finally began to expose deeper cracks in the family. Arguments became more frequent, and the tension between their parents grew heavier each day. "We cannot keep fixing everything for him," their father said one night, his voice filled with frustration. Their mother responded sharply, "He is our son, what do you expect us to do?" The conversation ended in silence, but the damage was already done. Without Helen there to balance everything, the weight of their choices became impossible to ignore. For the first time, they were forced to face the reality they had avoided for years. Then the calls started coming, first from her mother, soft and careful, almost as if nothing had changed. "Helen, we just wanted to check on you," she said in a voicemail. Helen listened to it quietly but did not respond. A few days later, her father called and left a shorter message, "We need to talk." Miriam asked her, "Are you going to call them back?" Helen shook her head slowly and replied, "Not yet." She knew exactly what would happen if she returned too soon. The same cycle would begin again. This time she was not going back until things were truly different. The silence from Helen made the house feel even heavier than before, like something important was missing that could not be replaced. Her mother began calling more often, leaving longer messages each time. "We miss you. The house is not the same without you," she said one evening, her voice softer than usual. Her father tried a different approach, leaving a short message that simply said, "We made a mistake." Logan overheard one of the messages and scoffed, "Why are you acting like she was doing everything?" Their father turned to him and replied sharply, "Because she was." For the first time, the truth was spoken out loud. Without Helen's steady presence, the family situation continued to decline in ways they could no longer hide. Her father began losing bigger opportunities as his work became inconsistent and unreliable. Clients who once trusted him started looking elsewhere, and his reputation slowly began to suffer. One afternoon he sat quietly and said, "I don't understand how everything is falling apart so fast." Her mother looked at him and answered, "Because we lost the one person holding it together." The realization hit harder each day, but no amount of regret could undo what had already been done. Their choices were finally catching up with them. Logan, however, remained unchanged, continuing to live as if nothing around him was collapsing. He stayed at home, contributing nothing while the pressure on their parents kept increasing. One night, their father confronted him again and said, "You need to start fixing your life." Logan rolled his eyes and replied, "Why are you suddenly acting like this?" That question hung in the air, unanswered but full of meaning. Their mother turned away, unable to defend him like she always had before. Slowly, the image they had built around Logan began to break apart. Far away from the chaos, Helen's life continued moving forward with quiet strength and focus. She had started her program, balancing work and studies with discipline and determination. One evening she stood in the workshop looking at her progress and said to herself, "I did this on my own." Miriam smiled proudly and replied, "You always could." Helen no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. Her success spoke for itself. Every step she took was a reminder that she had made the right decision. For the first time, her future felt secure and entirely hers. The breaking point came when the pressure at home became too much for her parents to carry. Bills piled up, stress increased, and the constant tension began to wear them down emotionally. One night, after a long argument, her father sat down and said quietly, "We chose wrong." Her mother broke down and replied, "We didn't see her value until she left." That moment marked the end of denial and the beginning of regret. For the first time, they were not blaming circumstances or making excuses. They were finally facing the truth, and it was heavier than anything they had ever carried before. The call came late in the evening when Helen was just getting back from a long day of work and study. She looked at the unknown number for a moment before answering, unsure of what to expect. "Hello," she said calmly, her voice steady. There was a pause on the other end before her father spoke, his voice sounding tired and unfamiliar. "Helen, it's me." She remained silent for a second, then replied, "I know." He took a deep breath and said softly, "Can we talk?" Her father did not waste time trying to soften the truth this time. He spoke plainly, almost like a man who had nothing left to hide. "Everything has fallen apart since you left," he admitted quietly. Helen listened without interrupting, letting him continue. "We thought we were helping Logan, but we were just enabling him," he said with regret. He paused before adding, "And we took from the one person who never asked for anything." Helen closed her eyes briefly but said nothing, allowing him to finish. Her mother joined the call, and before she could even form her words, her voice broke. "Helen, I am so sorry," she said, struggling to hold back tears. "We failed you and we didn't even realize it until you were gone." Helen sat down slowly, holding the phone tightly but keeping her composure. "You always chose him," she said quietly, not accusing, just stating a truth that had lived with her for years. There was silence on the line, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, no one tried to argue or explain it away. Her father spoke again, this time with a weight that felt real. "We had it backwards," he said. "We gave everything to the one who wasted it and nothing to the one who would have built something with it." Helen took a slow breath and replied, "I did build something, just without you." The words were not said in anger, but they carried more power than anything she had ever said before. Her mother cried softly, unable to respond immediately. In that moment, the distance between them felt both painful and necessary. After a long silence, Helen finally said what she had been holding on to since the day she left. "I am not coming back to be the person I was," she said firmly. Her father nodded on the other end, even though she could not see him. "We understand," he replied, his voice low. Helen continued, "If we are going to have a relationship, it will be different this time." Her mother quickly said, "Anything, we just want you in our lives." Helen paused, then answered, "Then it has to be on my terms." A few days after the call, Helen agreed to meet them, but only in a neutral place where she felt comfortable. They chose a quiet restaurant, far from the house that once held so many memories. When she walked in, both of her parents stood up immediately, almost nervous, like they were meeting her for the first time. "Helen," her mother said softly, unsure of what to do next. Helen gave a small nod and replied, "Let's sit." The air between them was heavy but not hostile, just unfamiliar. For once, the balance had shifted and everyone in the room could feel it. As they sat down, her father tried to start a normal conversation, but it was clear things were no longer the same. "How is work going?" he asked, this time genuinely interested. Helen looked at him and answered, "It's going well, I am making progress." He nodded slowly, listening carefully, something he had never truly done before. Her mother added, "We heard you started your program. We are proud of you." Helen paused for a moment, then said, "Thank you," keeping her tone calm and steady. It was a simple exchange, but it carried a new kind of respect that had never existed before. Throughout the dinner, one thing stood out clearly: Logan was never mentioned. It was as if they all understood that bringing him into the conversation would break the fragile progress they were making. At one point, her mother hesitated and asked, "Would you ever consider coming home again?" Helen looked at her directly and replied, "That is not my home anymore." Her father lowered his gaze but did not argue, he simply nodded in understanding. The truth was clear: Helen had moved forward and there was no returning to what once was. This was not a reunion to restore the past, it was a meeting to redefine the future. A week later, her father visited her workplace to see what she had been building on her own. He stood quietly, watching her work with focus and confidence, noticing the skill and independence she had developed. "You did all this yourself?" he asked, his voice filled with something deeper than pride. Helen looked at him and replied, "Yes, I did." He nodded slowly, taking in the reality of who she had become without their support. In that moment, he understood that she was no longer the daughter they overlooked. She was someone who had earned her place entirely on her own. As her father prepared to leave, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, "We should have seen you sooner." Helen met his eyes and replied, "I was always here, you just weren't looking." There was no anger in her voice, only truth, and that made it even more powerful. He gave a small nod, accepting the weight of her words without trying to defend himself. As he walked away, Helen returned to her work, focused and steady. She had not only rebuilt her life, she had redefined her worth, and this time, no one could take it away from her. After that meeting, Helen returned fully to her routine, but something inside her felt lighter than before. She was no longer carrying unanswered questions or waiting for validation that might never come. One evening, Miriam asked her, "How do you feel after seeing them again?" Helen thought for a moment and replied, "At peace, but not the way they expected." She explained that she no longer needed anything from them to feel complete. Miriam smiled and said, "That means you really moved on." Helen nodded quietly, knowing that for the first time she truly had. Back at her parents' new home, the reality of their situation continued to settle in slowly but heavily. Life was simpler now, but also more difficult, and every decision carried weight. Her father worked longer hours trying to rebuild what he had lost step by step. One night he sat down and said, "We cannot keep living like this forever." Her mother looked at him and replied, "Then something has to change." Both of them knew exactly what that meant, even if they had avoided it for years. This time, avoiding it was no longer an option. Logan finally faced a kind of pressure he had never experienced before, and it forced him to make uncomfortable decisions. One morning, his father stood in front of him and said firmly, "You need to get a job and start contributing." Logan tried to brush it off at first, but this time there was no room for excuses. "We are not carrying you anymore," his father added, his voice steady. For the first time, Logan realized things had truly changed. He left the house that day quieter than usual, with no arguments, no confidence, just reality. A few weeks later, Logan returned home and said, "I got a job at a warehouse." His mother looked surprised, while his father simply nodded and replied, "Good, keep it." There was no celebration, no special treatment, just expectation. Logan sat down and said nothing more, as if he was still adjusting to this new version of his life. It was not easy for him, but it was necessary. For once, he was being treated like an adult, not someone who needed constant rescue. Meanwhile, Helen continued to move forward, her life steadily growing stronger with each passing day. She was earning, learning, and building something that no one had handed to her. One evening, she looked at her plans and smiled, saying quietly, "I am ahead of where I thought I would be." Miriam laughed and replied, "Of course you are, you stopped waiting." Helen leaned back and said, "I didn't lose anything. I just stopped giving it away." In that moment, Everything came full circle, not as revenge but as clarity. She had not just left her past behind, she had outgrown it completely. Months passed, and the distance between Helen and her family slowly became something calmer and more controlled. They spoke occasionally, mostly short calls that stayed respectful and simple. Her mother once said, "We are trying to do better, one step at a time." Helen listened and replied, "That is all I expect." There was no rush to fix everything, no pressure to return to what once was. For the first time, their relationship was not built on obligation but on choice. And that made all the difference. Her father continued working hard to rebuild both his business and his sense of responsibility. One evening, during a quiet visit, he said, "I used to think providing money was enough." Helen looked at him and replied, "It was never about the money." He nodded slowly, understanding what he had missed for so many years. "I see that now," he admitted, his voice filled with regret but also growth. That conversation did not erase the past, but it showed that change was finally happening. And for Helen that was enough. Logan's journey remained uncertain, but at least it had finally begun. He kept his job, showed up daily, and slowly started learning what responsibility meant. One day he called Helen unexpectedly and said, "I didn't realize how much you carried for all of us." Helen was quiet for a moment before replying, "You never had to notice back then." There was no anger in her voice, only truth. Logan sighed and said, "I am trying now." And for once those words sounded real. Helen, on the other hand, had already built something solid, something no one could take away from her. She stood in her workspace one evening, looking at everything she had created with her own effort and discipline. "This is mine," she said softly, a small smile forming on her face. Miriam stood beside her and replied, "You earned every part of it." Helen nodded, knowing that every struggle had shaped her into who she had become. She was no longer the girl waiting to be chosen, she was the woman who chose herself. Looking back, Helen did not see her story as one of loss, but as one of awakening. She had walked away from a life where she was invisible and built one where she was undeniable. Her parents learned their lessons, her brother faced reality, but most importantly, she found her worth without needing anyone else to define it. As she closed her notebook one night, she whispered to herself, "I was never second. I was just surrounded by people who couldn't see my value." And this time she did not need them to.